The scriptures, such as the Upanishads and others, declare that to be endowed with the conceptions of I and mine constitutes bondage, while being without the conceptions of I and mine constitutes liberation. What does it mean? Does it mean that there are two states for the self, bondage and liberation? No, it does not mean that. The self, which is of the nature of being, consciousness, bliss, is invariable, without conditions, without states, and undergoes no change. Therefore, it is the abiding reality, and it is absolute in nature, not in relation to anything else. So it cannot be described, in truth, in terms of being bound or liberated. But when you imagine that your existence, which is infinite, formless, and undifferentiated, is some kind of entity, and I, such as bondage. And when you claim something as your own, mine, such as bondage. When there is the conception, I am what I think, I am the body, I am the one who senses, I am the experiencer, and so forth and so on. Such is bondage, superimposed merely by imagination upon your real identity, which is existence, consciousness, bliss. When you imagine, these are my thoughts, my memories, my ideas, my experiences, my body, my sensing, my world, my objects, and so forth. Such is imagined bondage, superimposed on the abiding reality. Whose bondage is it? If we inquire as to that, as the Maharshi reveals, both the bondage and the one who is bound, being unreal, vanish. The I that is bound is as imaginary as the bondage which he can claim as his. What then is liberation? From the position or perspective of there actually existing a bound one, one's own natural state, or being itself, is regarded as a state of liberation, as if it were something other, to whatever degree, even slight, than oneself. This is because the identity has been falsely taken up as the bound individual, the I, who can have my state of bondage and my state of liberation. The view for liberation pertains to truth, but the stand as the individual is entirely false. If you inquire, who is it that appears as the individual? The individuality, being only superimposed by imagination, disappears. And what was previously regarded as the state of liberation is self-revealed as the very nature of your own being. Therefore, to be free from bondage, to attain liberation, what is required is the deepest knowledge of your own existence. It is in this knowledge of your own existence that we can say that there is no bondage to be destroyed and no liberation to be attained. What is pivotal in the inquiry is the examination of the one who would experience either of these states. When I say either of these states, it includes all possibilities of states. For any other state different from liberation should be regarded as bondage, some kind of limitation, whether it's waking, dreaming, sleeping, or any mode of mind. Who is it within you that feels I? Who is it within you that can say, mine? Even to the extent that we regard something as existing apart from ourselves, and do not exercise a gross form of possession over it, still it is my experience, my perception. Who is it that says, mine? If the false conceptions of I and mine are destroyed, liberation is revealed. It is as if that which is eternally free gets free again. Well, it has always been free. The wrong identity ceases. And the nature of existence, the self, which is eternally the same, knows itself. Your nature is the formless being, the space-like consciousness, the uncaused bliss. Your nature is the self, Brahman, and nothing less, nothing other. If your experience seems to be otherwise, examine the you or the your in that experience. And imagination will vanish. The reality will remain. If you have a question at any point this morning, feel free to ask. Or if you wish to relate your own experience at any time, please feel free to speak.
In a recent Satsang, Stan was asking about Ramana's instruction of Muruganar, which seems to be kind of what today's discourse was also about. Watch from where the I arises. As I do this in my own practice, I just, thinking about it again, and which is probably where the source of many of these problems is, of course, I wonder, there are different ways to watch. One way is to watch thoughts come. Another way, it seemed, is when genuinely quiet, there seems not to be an I. And then, again, it seems like the thought comes, and with it comes this I. Is that appropriate watching?
If we speak of watching thought, you are already perceiving thought. So if we engage in an exercise of watching thought, it is somewhat redundant, isn't it?
Yes.
Nothing new is attained thereby. However, some people, when they exercise themselves in some kind of practice involving watching thought, feel some degree of freedom. It'd be wise for them to discern what is causing the degree of freedom that they are feeling. It has very little to do with the redundant watching of thought, since they're already watching it, inasmuch as a thought is known. If it were not known, you would have no experience of it. But if even accidentally there is some shift in what one regarded as his identity, freedom shines. To the degree one's true identity is discerned, to that degree the freedom and peace shine. The same thing happens when one is quiet in some way or another. Of course, unless there is knowledge of the self, the false identity, the misidentification will recur. And then peace or freedom seem elusive. In your grasp one moment, out of the grasp another. The way to be steady in it is to see whose grasp it is. Otherwise, peace, freedom, and such will seem as if passing states, just like the thoughts are passing states. The identity of the passing modes or states, the identity of the one who experiences these passing modes and states, is what gives reality, apparently, to those states and modes. If we inquire as to whose they are, who am I, the sense of reality returns to its origin, the identity becoming steadily established in its real nature no longer gives rise to the individual, or to the idea of differentiated thoughts, or the various modes or states of mind in which that individual will become immersed after projecting them with his own imagination. Clear so far?
Yes, certainly it's much more watching the watcher than it is watching the watched.
So when we speak of watching or observing the rise of the I, what is really indicated is perception or discerning the identity of the I, or we may say the root or whence the I arises. From where does the sense of I arise? It obviously does not arise from a physical place in the body. It cannot arise from within the thoughts of the mind, because the thoughts of the mind succeed and do not precede the I. So where does this I arise? It seems as if to bubble up, that's all it is, a bubble, from the depths of the ocean of pure existence and consciousness itself. But that ocean of existence consciousness is homogeneous, and there's nothing else to act upon it to create the separate I. So the instruction, reiterated by Muruganar, proclaimed by the Maharshi, is to discern or watch, where does this I rise? Or see it as it arises. If we proceed in this kind of inquiry, symbolized by the destruction of the demon of forgetfulness beneath the foot of Nataraja and Dakshinamurti and such, if we proceed in this way, then its birthplace is its death place. How does the birthplace become its death place? If we discern the unborn nature of our existence, it neither gives birth to anything, nor is it started by anything itself. Nothing comes before it, nothing comes after it. But we need to discern this by immediate direct experience, tracing the sense of identity itself back to its very source. All forms of identity rest on the I. Discern where this I starts. What is the most basic notion or assumption? And how does it start? If we observe keenly and steadily this way, it will not start, and we will see that it has never started. And the eternal nature of enlightenment or liberation thus becomes self-evident. Clear enough?
Kind of, I guess, a step before that discernment, and maybe what isn't that much of a step, but you were asking about the me and mind, and so I was kind of meditating on that, and noticing that it's just self-conjured ideas in my mind. And I guess similar to what you were just discussing, though, kind of noticing that it's sort of, I guess, that brings about a little bit of a detachment, just because it can't be who I am. I mean, it can't be something objective. I can't be those things. So just noticing that kind of seemed like it brought more detachment.
All right. Is your mind also one of those things? My mind.
Yeah. In terms of something objective.
As terms of something to which you should be utterly detached.
Yeah. Well, my mind. I guess it's just one of those. It would just be one of those notions. Kind of, lump them into a thing and you say, no, that's my mind.
Okay.
One of the many.
If the mind is a notion, and that notion contains all other notions, how does the mind get started at all? If all notions are foreign in the mind, and the mind itself is a notion, does one notion have another?
Yeah, it is kind of strange.
The explanation is good, inasmuch as it propels you to the deeper and perfect wisdom of knowing yourself. But is there something really formed called the mind, or the notions and such?
Okay. So you're saying that was there real existence in those thoughts? Or something of reality, partaking of reality? Something that would have real substance? Or are they just totally bogus hallucinations? Yeah, that's what it seems like, that everything that is real, and that's sort of, I guess, where the discernment comes from. Where does the reality come from versus, did it really come from those thoughts? In other words, if it didn't come from the thoughts, then where did it come from?
The reality must come from the one who knows the thoughts. If there is this, it derives its reality from that which is the self. But in knowing the nature of the self, does it lend reality to anything else? The self is declared to be the substrate, the all-illuminator, the all-knower, the all-doer, the all-pervading, etc. In order to show its ultimate and transcendent nature, and to eliminate any residual belief in something objectively existing, something existing apart from the self. But it does not mean that the self is those things.
Yeah, it would lose, it's sort of like the meditation, it should lose its form, right? In other words, you wouldn't have a formed, objective, anything objective, right?
It would not be in relation to anything else. If it were in relation to anything else, there would not be non-duality.
So you say relation to anything else, something objective, or?
If there's something else, in one sense, it's a denial of the absolute nature of Brahman, or the self.
Yeah.
Then something else is existing along with it, inside it, outside it, even pervaded by it. But if that, which is the self, alone is, then such is non-dual, such is absolute, such is reality. Where there are differences, there is imagination. Where there are no differences, there is reality.
And that,
Hence the questions about the mind and notions.
yeah, because minds and notions, yeah, that's made up of stuff that can't be present. And it seems like that's the case. As my meditation goes deeper, those notions just lose significance, or lose, I guess the reality is divested of those ideas. So they're So you're just asking me though, was that reality ever in those ideas? You know, in other words, I'm sort of still giving, like the reality was sort of, you know, making them real somehow. Or actually, you know, they were actually real. You're saying pull that, return to the source completely.
Be thorough in the knowledge. Divested, the self should be seen divested of every idea, including the idea that it could have any connection with ideas at any time. The self is ever the same, and you are that self. You are not bound now. You will not be bound in the future. So can you truthfully be said to have been bound in the past?
Yeah, it's one of those, what is a past anyway? Is that something that exists? That it can only exist as a thought. And then for that thought, you'd have to have something for that thought to pertain to, a body of the world, whatever, or some sort of amorphous mind.
And someone who has that thought. But knowing the truth revealed by who am I, all that illusion is blown away without a trace.
Sort of goes, you know, and I guess it's important because all the sages say there's a reality that is ever existent, permanent. And the root cause, you know, I still kind of have a cause to meditation or something that's not that reality. You know, just because I sort of attribute, focus or concentration. Because it seems like, in the meditation, when there's, similar to what Richard and you were discussing, right? When there's certain awareness of what's ignorance or what can't be yourself, it seems like there's clarity that cannot be yourself, right? But it seems like not doing that.
Is that experience of clarity, is that a concentration of mind, or is it something in which the mind is not a factor?
Yeah. Yeah. It's taking apart the mind. But there's an intention that kind of, when you say, I'm going to meditate on what is real, it seems like that's an intention or a thought or something.
What is the cause of that intention?
Yeah, it would be on reality, because that doesn't do anything. At least it seems like, how could it do that, right? How could something that's not partaking of the real ever do something that's real?
If it has no substance,
Yeah.
it has no consciousness.
Yeah, exactly. So that wouldn't make any sense.
So where does the intention come from? The intention may take the form of some thought, or may be underlying at a deeper level than manifested thought. What is the cause? Liberation is said in some texts to be self-caused. Does it mean that one's ego causes liberation? The individual does it in contrast to relying on the help of someone else? That would be a very shallow interpretation. For better or for worse, that'd be very shallow. If it's its own cause, the meaning must be the self-existent nature of moksha or liberation. Then to say reality is its own cause, or that it is utterly uncaused, is identical. When we say it's uncaused, does it mean it happens by random? Randomness would just be a cause that's not perceived clearly.
Right, yeah.
Uncaused means there's no cause and effect relation because there are not two. Likewise, self-caused. Nothing brings about the existence or nature of yourself other than that existence or nature itself. When seen like this, it is not a bringing about, it just is.
So it seems like, though, that there's a gravity or a drawing towards real. In other words...
Yes, but who gets drawn?
Okay.
Within the context of the individual, there seems to be something at the heart of the individual that gives rise to such intention and calls him to return. The water rising up into clouds must eventually return through rain, rivers, streams, rivers, etc., return to the ocean again. Such is the analogy used by the Maharshi in one of his hymns to Arunachala. But when we inquire and know the self as it is there departing and returning? For that which has separation, there must be union or yoga. In the realization of the eternally undifferentiated, there is knowledge or jnana.
It seems like it's always clarifying, though, exactly. Similar to what you're talking about with Richard, very, clarifying that root of yourself. Because that's where the confusion comes in. And that's where it leaves.
Where it comes in is exactly where it leaves. So yes, clear, deep self-knowledge is the necessity. Once that is overlooked or put aside, there will be any kind of illusion. Then there'll be some kind of explanation for that illusion. If the explanation points to the disillusion of the illusion, it's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But in the end, you must come right back to the starting place. So where are you now?
That's only to be experienced.
Thank you, Master. I wanted to ask about one way of using the dream analogy. If the character identified with in a dream has an urge to know the truth of his situation and encounters a sage in the dream, what appears to be a sage, and the sage says, the actual fact is that all this is your dream, then the truth of that could well be enough to awaken that dreamer. There'd be no reason to also require that the assumed dream character exhibit any other phenomena. In other words, it doesn't have to, in other words, the recognition that it's a dream doesn't have to be voiced, as it were, in the dream character who was, up until that point, immersed in the dream. If it comes from a wise, awake being, and the depth of that is felt and recognized, that could be enough to awaken the dreamer.
All right. Now, have you been having such dreams?
No, well, I mean, I've had dreams a little bit like that, but not recently. I'm using it more as a comparison with this one at the moment.
All right. Yeah. That's why you said dream analogy.
Right. It's not analysis.
There's waking state, there's dreaming state, there's deep dreamless sleep state. Someone seems to experience each of those. Gaudapada points out that you could say that there's an individual experiencer for each of those, so that there are 3 different experiencers, which is corroborated by the experience that they don't agree with each other in terms of their knowledge of these states. That would mean that you are not in any of those. You are not any of those experiencers, and you're not in any of those states. Who then are you? If that is known, what can we say about these various dreams and dream characters? What can we say about the wise ones and the ignorant ones and so forth? Self-knowledge is necessary. But self-knowledge belongs only to the self, not to the character. Does the character wake up? You wake up from the character. In terms of illusion, it is sufficient to know illusion as illusion for it to be no more.
So if that character genuinely knows it.
The character knows nothing. He's a figment of imagination.
Right. So if the illusion is known as illusion, there'll be nothing impelling the character, or nothing impelling, well, I keep wanting to say the character because who else could I refer to, but
If the illusion is known as
no impulse to hold on or entangle.
Yes, if the illusion is known as illusion, the dream character and his dream, the subject and the object, both cease to exist. The dreamer himself does not exist, let alone the character he thinks himself to be.
Something I wanted to ask that might be related, maybe it doesn't relate, is the sense of seeing the individual as a role. In other words, in a relative way, if someone is to open a door to walk into a room not knowing who's there, if there's a stranger, a role of civility, if a close friend, a role of familiarity, if a son or daughter, a parental role, that the person entering will move right into the role. And then when no longer needed, maybe because of leaving the room, the role will just vanish.
Well, that's good proof that you can't be any of the roles you play.
Including is,
Because you don't vanish, just the role vanishes.
right, but is this individual itself just a role? That, so that it is not,
All right. Good, maybe useful to view it that way. The next question then, if you're inquiring deeply, is who plays the role? A role is there, which is basically a form of definition, as described to you in relation to somebody else. But the definition could be without relation to somebody else. It could just be a figment within one's own mind.
some computers or,
So a role is just a definition, and there implied someone who has that definition. The role that has all the other roles. Whose is this primal role? In one sense, we can say the one self appears as all the individuals, including the one you style yourself, and therefore takes on all the roles. But how does the self become individualized? The explanation is good enough as far as showing that the nature of all the individuals is really the one undivided self. But if that self really and truly is one and undivided, how could it become individualized? If its nature is pure consciousness, how could it dream? If there's a dream, the whole of it is only the consciousness. But if the consciousness is what is real, and changelessly so, can it dream?
the reverse idea that there were separate individuals would be based on sense experience and thought conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
So you would have to take those sense thoughts and concluding thoughts to be persisting or existing or having a substance in order to maintain the wrong view of there being all these separate individuals.
Exactly so, which is why in the pursuit of self-knowledge, we negate the sensing and the conceptual on our way in. Otherwise, we find ourselves saying, yes, the self is real and it is dreaming these individuals. But how do we know about the individuals? Only through the sense perceptions of various bodies. Are you the body? Are you the senses? Do the senses show you what is real? If we understand like this, then that doubt doesn't arise, does it? We cannot simultaneously have the knowledge the self is or the self is real and an ego exists, individuals are, embodiment is true. You cannot have ignorance and knowledge simultaneous. If they seem as if simultaneous, then we haven't really known, have we? If we really know, ignorance ceases to exist from that moment on.
So it can't be a snaky rope.
Yeah, exactly. Snaky rope, a rope that undergoes snake conditions from time to time, according to cosmic cycles, etc. No. If we really know it's a rope, the snake, the attributes and activities of the snake, the qualities of snakiness, etc., cease to exist for us because they were just imagined from that moment on. And then in line with what we were speaking about earlier, although I said from that moment on, there is the certitude of in the realization that the rope was always a rope. There was never a snake. The real was always real. The self always the self. There never was the illusory ego entity and his world. So your question amounts to, if a snake, a friendly snake, happens to meet a friendly rope, does the rope's statements about them both being ropes, not a snake, does that do the trick? From another angle of vision completely. If there is the depth of knowledge, whether it's one's own silent inquiry or the instruction of a self-realized sage, it is sufficient. The knowledge is what is essential. It will most certainly wake one up from the dream of samsara and put an end to all the illusory bondage. Listening or shravana at that point becomes identical with inquiry. Likewise, manana or reflection on what is said, and nididhyasana or constant meditation upon what has been reflected on and heard. They are all the same at this depth.
Could you just say a little more about silent inquiry?
In the teachings of the Maharshi, silence is indicative of that state in which no false sense of I arises. Where no false sense of I arises, then nothing appended to the I, my experience, my limitation, my bondage, my suffering, etc., arises either. Inquiry thus resolves itself in silence. We start with our own existence, that is basic. Even if we assume that existence at first to be individualized, we start just with that, because that is the constant factor in one's experience. Who am I? Plunging inward. The I loses its I-ness. What remains is the great silent self, perpetual being.
That seems to be the place that I find myself much of the time. I mean, the questions just seem to have grown pointless. You know, the outward questioning is, at some point in apparent time, a few years ago, the question was posed, have you ever known a time when you were not? And at that point, there was a shift. And so, I mean, I find myself back and forth, you know, in this apparent life. But then back to this place where just the questions, you know, the actual asking questions is just not very important. And so where the peace is seems to be in this place where there is just silence, which, I mean, still this time it comes and goes. But so that's why I asked the question.
All right. The silence is deeper than the level at which the doubts or questions arise.
I think so.
There is another kind of questioning which those who are deeply diving deeply with inquiry use or experience when they're questioning their very own nature. These are not so much doubts about other things, but a questing within to know one's own nature. It fuses with the silence. Therefore, the instruction that we see, for example, as recorded in the Vedas and elsewhere, of those becoming self-realized by the instructions of rishis who are answering their questions. Those questions are very beneficial. They merge with silence. They cause the going in and out described by you to subside. So that kind of questioning, which is born entirely interiorly of one's own experience, with a yearning to rest in absolute truth, that kind of questioning can be encouraged. It is very worthwhile. And the answers to those kinds of questions, whether pointed to in a satsang or a text, or without such pointing, those answers are silence itself.
I like that answer.
श्रीभगवानुवाच इदं शरीरं कौन्तेय क्षेत्रमित्यभिधीयते एतद्यो वेत्ति तं प्राहुः क्षेत्रज्ञ इति तद्वितः.
This, the body, O son of Kunti, is called Kshetra. Him who knows it, they who know them call Kshetranya.
क्षेत्रज्ञं चापि मां विद्धि सर्वक्षेत्रेषु भारत. क्षेत्रक्षेत्रज्ञयोर्ज्ञानं यत्तज्ज्ञानं मतं मम.
And do thou also know me as Krishetnyanya in all Kshetras, O Bharata? The knowledge of Kshetra and Kshetranya is deemed by me as the knowledge.
तत्क्षेत्रं यच्च यादृक् च यद्विकारी यतश्च यत् स च यो यत्प्रभावश्च तत्समासेन मे शृणु.
And what that Kshetra is, and of what nature, and what its changes, and whence is what, and who he is, and what his powers, this hear thou briefly from me.
ऋषिभिर्बहुधा गीतं छन्दोभिर्विविधैः पृथक् ब्रह्मसूत्रपदैश्चैव हेतुमद्भिर्विनिश्चितैः.
Sung by sages in many ways and distinctly, in various hymns, as also in the suggestive words about Brahman, full of reasoning and decisive.
महाभूतान्यहङ्कारो बुद्धिरव्यक्तमेव च इन्द्रियाणि दशैकं च पञ्चचेन्द्रियगोचराः.
The great elements, egoism, reason, as also the unmanifested, the 10 senses and one, and the 5 objects of the senses.
इच्छा द्वेषसुखं दुःखं संखादश्चेतना धृतिः एतत्क्षेत्रं समासेन सविकारं मुदाहृतम्.
Desire, hatred, pleasure, pain, the aggregate, intelligence, courage, the Kshetra has been thus briefly described with its modifications.
अमानित्वम् अदम्भित्वम् अहिंसा क्षान्तिरार्जवम् आचार्योपासनं शौचं स्थैर्यमात्मविनिग्रहः.
Humility, modesty, innocence, patience, uprightness, service of the teacher, purity, steadfastness, self-control.
इन्द्रियार्थेषु वैराग्यं मनहङ्कार एव च जन्म मृत्युजरा व्याधि दुःखदोषानुदर्शनम्.
Absence of attachment for objects of the senses, and also absence of egoism, perception of evil in birth, death, and old age, in sickness and pain.
असक्तिरनभिष्वङ्गः पुत्रदारगृहादिषु नित्यं च समचित्तत्वम् इष्टानिष्टोपपत्तिषु.
Unattachment, absence of affection for son, wife, home, and the like, and constant equanimity on the attainment of the desirable and the undesirable.
मयि चानन्ययोगेन भक्तिरव्यभिचारिणी विविक्तदेशसेवित्वम् अरतिर्जनसंसदि.
Unflinching devotion to me in yoga of non-separation, resort to solitary places, distaste for the society of men.
अध्यात्मज्ञाननित्यत्वम् तत्त्वज्ञानार्थदर्शनम् एतज्ज्ञानमिति प्रोक्तम् अज्ञानं यततोऽन्यथा.
Constancy in self-knowledge, perception of the end of the knowledge of truth. This is declared to be knowledge, and what is opposed to it is ignorance.